kVp, and we're going to go through all of the aspects of kVp. Well, almost all the aspects of kVp. We're not going to get into the discussion about ionization and as it affects dose mathematically in the patient. But we're going to talk about kVp and what happens whenever we adjust kVp, and we're going to be pretty comprehensive about it, but it's not going to go that deep into things that you're just not going to be tested on, and you're not going to be tested on the registry. So we're going to look at all the claims of kVp, which there's a lot, and they seem to contradict, and that's what the confusion is, and what some of the confusion was on Wednesday, because both, specifically in context of what we were talking about on Wednesday, as kVp increases, we increase penetration, and all interactions go down, and yet simultaneously scatter goes up. So how can that possibly be? Well, I'm going to hopefully, explain that to you and help you to understand it. So just as a preface to that, we've got a lot of things that we've got to consider in the X-ray beam. We've got an X-ray beam inside of the X-ray tube. We have an X-ray beam emitted from the X-ray tube before it interacts with the patient. We have interactions in the patient, and then we have remnant beam and what's going on with the remnant beam. And I think that's where the confusion is with the scatter versus interaction. Okay, so with that in mind, this is probably going to take us 2 days. I started putting this together on Friday. I came down with this head cold. I started putting it together Thursday. I came down with this head cold on Thursday. I don't have any classes on Thursday, so I took off and worked on this primarily. And I've built on it since then. I was working on it this morning. So there may be some spelling, some typos or things like that. I haven't, since today was the last day that I was working on it, I've not gone through it all the way to check for spelling errors and things like that. So if there's anything like that, forgive me. Also, though, I sound like I've been up all night smoking cigars and drinking whiskey. I know that. I'm feeling much better than what I was, so I think I'm on the mend. I'm just a little raw in the throat. So forgive that. It's kind of a chore to project whenever your voice is like this. So this is going to be exhausting, but we're going to see what we can do. So in this presentation, what we're going to talk about is a lot of stuff. A lot of stuff from a lot of different directions. We've got like 9 or 10 different claims on kVp. Some seem to be contradictory, but there's a lot of context and nuance that we have to talk about to really understand kVp. And traditionally, I'd kind of bleed out kVp a little bit at a time just because it's so complicated. And generally in first semester or second semester imaging, I stick to just the basics. As kVp goes up, scatter increases, which is true, and yet it decreases at the same time. So we'll get there. So I'm already getting looks. So we'll get there here in a bit, but there are a lot of claims, and I stopped numbering somewhere around 8, but there's about 10 different claims in there on kVp. Okay, and almost all of them true. So just so that you know what I've done is I've taken a lot of quotes out of Bushong. I've taken some out of Fauber. I've taken some out. Who's your Rabbo author? Stay Wiki or something like that? I don't know. Anyway, whoever it is, I've taken some out of that too. So, and I've taken one off the internet as well. So we're going to start very basic, because there were some questions on the test on Wednesday about the creation of high kVp and what's responsible for that. So we're going to back all the way back up and talk about that. So where you see direct quotes, it's going to be in quotations. If I add personal thoughts, they won't be in quotations, or if they are in the middle of a quote, I'll put it in brackets so that hopefully it'll help to clear it up. And sometimes the the wording in some of these quotes just gets cumbersome, so I'll just end a quote and sum up the rest of it. And, again, make it a little less cumbersome. So, that's kind of what all that's about. But once we get down into this sort of and in context, that's kind of your hint that something else is coming. True in context means that there's some nuance that you need to understand why the statement that's made or the claim that's made is true. Okay? So you can't just take something like you increase kVp, you increase scatter. Well, it's true, but you got to understand why you're increasing scatter. All right? So, and we'll get there. All right, so claims about kVp, this is everything that we're going to be looking at. Changes in kVp affect technique more than any other single factor, and that's absolutely true. So some of these things are going to be absolutely true, some of them are going to be true in context. Some of them are going to be true with nuance. So that one is just indisputable. It's the main thing that's going to affect everything in your X-ray beam. Okay, so without kVp, high enough kVp, you don't get penetration. Without high enough kVp, you just don't get an image. Right, so kVp affects radiographic technique more than anything else. And we'll get there and why that is here in a minute. Increase in kVp increases patient dose. True in context, we'll talk about that. 15% increase in kVp equals doubling of mass. True in context, not absolutely true. kVp can be used to change image receptor exposure, absolutely true. Increase in kVp decreases patient dose, which is a direct contradiction of what we had up there, but it's also true in context. Increase in kVp decreases all interaction, which is true. Increase in kVp increases scatter, which is true, again, in context. Then other things, this is where I just stop trying to number them as we go through the PowerPoints. Each one of those are numbered, but once I get down here, it's just like, I just throw it at them. So image quality, scattered to the IR, can be affected by kVp. Well, it is affected by kVp. Whether or not it affects the image is, we'll talk about that. Anyway, noise of all types. Fog absolutely goes up with increase in kVp, and quantum model can be affected as well. And then finally, high kVp, low mass techniques are truly better for the equipment. And we'll talk about that. So what is voltage? Voltage is, just to sum up this slide, is the motivation behind the electron. So in electricity is just the study of moving electrons, right? So we have positive and negative charges in our atom. The positive charges don't move. That's what the atom is. So whenever you have a wire, the wire is determined by the atomic number of the element in the wire. Copper is very common. And the protons within that copper don't move, right? So what moves is the electrons on the outside of it. So in order to move those electrons, you have to have some sort of motivation. And that motivation is adding more electrons, essentially, right? So you increase the electrostatic charge, and we talked about that last semester, and because all of our electrons are negative, you try to push them together, and what happens to them? They go apart, right? So like charges repel, so the more of those electric charges we cram together, the more motivation they have to move. And that motivation is measured in voltage, okay? So our voltage is, you can think of it as a pushing force, you can think of it as a pulling force. For our purposes, doesn't matter which way you look at it. It just is what makes the electrons move, okay? So when you hit your exposure button, you take that space charge and you zip it across the X-ray tube really, really fast. That's the voltage that's causing it. So what we've got is the difference between the positive charge and the negative charge on the two electrodes inside of your X-ray tube. That will be your anode and your cathode. So you hit your exposure, you apply the kVp, those negative charges go up. The anode is, comparatively positively charged. And the electrons move from cathode to anode really fast. Okay, so that's the job of the kVp. So that last charge came from this website, Geeks for Geeks. But I thought it was pretty good. So every time you hear So every time you hear kVp, there's a whole litany of things you need to be thinking of. kV equals kVp. They mean the same thing. You technologists may not say kVp, they mean kVp when they say kV. All right, so kVp controls the energy of our X-ray beam. That's the peak energy, right? So it's peak energy, penetrability. kVp controls whether or not we're going to penetrate. Now, I said something on Wednesday that seemed to indicate that 30 kVp wouldn't penetrate much. And it will, much more so than what you think it will. Okay, so in context of what I was saying was, if we set a 90 kVp X-ray beam, our average energy is 1/3 of that, which is 30 kVp, right? And then I said, set 30 kVp on your machine and see what you can penetrate. Well, the P, again, is peak energy, right? So on the brim spectrum, we'll take a look at that here in a minute, very few of the X-ray photons that we get out of the X-ray tube when we set a kVp are going to be the peak energy, right? So you can set as low a kVp. I really encourage y'all to do this. I know I sound like a broken record. Not that you know what a broken record is. It skips, all right? It skips and it goes back and it says the same thing over and over again. That's why people say, yeah, sound like a broken record. Sound like a broken record because I say play with your equipment, right? Play with your equipment. Mock up a patient. A patient has to have something that's radio opaque and something that's relatively radiolucent, right? So take something, and you can bring something from home. If your dog has a bone, stick it in your backpack and bring it. A real bone, not a milk bone. Stick it in your backpack and bring it. Take that, get you a basin of water, put it in the basin of water. Now you've got a femur, essentially, right? Because you've got a fluid top structure with a bone inside of it. And make x-rays of that. Use low kVp, use high kVp, change your focal spot size, change your distances, change your OID, change your SID. You've got downtime at clinicals, I know you do. I was a student once, I was a clinical instructor once. There are times you're standing around and you're not doing anything but gossiping, right? How much good is that doing you? Really? Get your butt in the room and start shooting stuff. Learn something, right? So try it. Just try it. It's fun, really. Once you get into it, because you start making exposures, you're like, wow, that didn't turn out anything like I expected it to. Let's try this, and we'll do something different, right? So play with the machines. They used to not like us to do that because X-ray film cost as much as $2.50 a piece. So, I shoot 10 X-rays. That's $25 of profit straight down the toilet. You don't have that problem now. You can just blast away all you want to. All right. So went all that way. Controls penetrability, potential difference, tube potential, electric potential, tension, electric tension. You'll sometimes see questions on tests refer to the high voltage transformer as a high tension transformer. It is what we use to control our beam quality. It's not the only thing that controls a beam quality, but it is one of the things. And then we've got frequency and wavelength. As kVp goes up, energy goes up, frequency goes up, wavelength goes down. Okay, so all of that stuff, any of those words, the first thing you should be thinking of when you see or hear those words is kVp. Okay? All right, so beam quality, we'll talk later in the semester about all the things that affect that. So intensity is just number of x-rays, so that's primarily your mass, but we can influence our intensity or the number of x-rays we create with kVp as well. Where mass, we adjust mass, the only thing that we affect is numbers. With kVp, we affect peak energy, we affect average energy, we affect numbers as well. So we affect everything with kVp. And that's why we say that with kVp, more than anything else, it affects the x-ray beam. So further, more on this. A system that possesses potential energy is a system with stored energy. So remember, we talk about kVp as potential. It's a difference between the cathode and anode end of the X-ray tube measured in voltage. The higher the voltage, the faster those electrons move across the X-ray tube. The faster they move across the X-ray tube, the more kinetic energy they have. And once they interact on the face of the target, the higher the possible beam energy we're gonna have, okay? So it's the potential energy. When positioned close together, like charges have a tendency to fly apart. And that's what we're trying to accomplish here. When they fly apart, now they've got kinetic energy because they're moving. Kinetic energy is energy of motion. Once they smack into the anode, they're gonna create primarily heat, but a small portion of that is gonna turn into X-rays as well, okay? So the higher the potential, excuse me, the greater the potential to do work. So the higher the kVp, the more likely we're gonna create X-rays in the energy level that we want to do the work we wanna do, which is penetrate the patient, right? So what that means is electricity is movement of electrons. Voltage is that motivation behind them. It's what pushes or pulls them. Again, doesn't matter from our perspective which way you want to consider that. Energy, the definition of energy from last semester is just the ability to do work. The potential is stored energy. It's not released, and it's not kinetic energy until you depress the exposure button. The electrons travel across the tube and create X-rays. So potential, it might be a short day. Potential energy is unrealized energy, turns into kinetic energy. That kinetic energy is carried in the electrons. Once they hit the anode, they become X-rays. So how's kVp made? We're going to talk about the components that we have to have. Line compensation, auto transformer, step up transformer, and then we don't necessarily have to have a kVp meter to make X-rays, but to know what the level of potential X-rays we're going to create, we have to have that. All right, so we have to legally make an X-ray on a patient. You want to know what your kVp is, right? Because you don't want to be doing barium studies with 50 kVp. You're going to be treating cancer on patients. So the circuit, we're going to break this apart and look at it, the individual components, but just running through the components. What we've got over here, the only thing, this is a bracket, okay? This is not describing, not pointing to a specific thing. This is a bracket, and it's showing you that this whole area down here is a filament circuit, okay? So remember, in Bushong, what he really just divided the entire circuit right here, and he said low voltage, high voltage. I don't really like that because this is low voltage, this is very low voltage, and that's very high voltage, okay? So I like this diagram a little bit better. This is referring to this entire lower circuit, which is a filament circuit, and that's where we get our mass, okay? Forget about that from this point forward until we get to mass. So this right here is our line compensation circuit. We have to have a meter to measure what the incoming line voltage is, and what the line voltage compensation circuit does is it adjusts the voltage coming into this thing, which is the auto transformer. Auto transformer is type of rheostat. So it adjusts that so that we know what the voltage is that's being fed on the front side of this. Essentially what this does is it does two things. One is it's a surge protector, so that at the moment that you make your X-rays, your incoming line voltage, I think according to Bushong, can fluctuate by as much as 5%. 5% can make a difference. If you make your exposure during a power surge where the power coming into your X-ray system increases by 5%, then essentially what you've done is you've increased the exposure to the patient by 30%. Okay? So you don't want that. And at the same time, if at the moment you make your exposure, the air conditioning kicked on, and you get that sucking of the power from all over the hospital and the lights dim, you make your exposure, then you're going to get 5 less kVp than what you need, right? So the purpose for this is to keep that at a constant input of voltage, so we know what we're adjusting, right? So then at the at the auto transformer, I can't get through auto transformer. At the auto transformer, what we get is adjustment of kVp, but we don't have kVp, right? So when you're pushing those buttons and it says kVp, you know, you go from 5 kVp to 10 kVp, or you increase by 5 or 10 kVp, you're not really adjusting kVp. It'll become kVp, but at that point, it's just voltage. So what you're actually doing is you're making contacts on the secondary side of the auto transformer. It works off transformer law, and transformer law says that if you feed alternating current to the primary side of any kind of transformer, then you create a changing magnetic field. The magnetic field flips back and forth, and then, you know, just to go over here, if we move a secondary coil close to it, then we can create a alternating current in secondary coil. And notice on this coil, what we have is we have more turns on the secondary side than what we have on the primary side, right? Mm-hmm. That means voltage is going to go up, all right? So back over here to the auto transformer, we only have one coil of wire. So that coil of wire sets up, we feed it alternating current. It sets up a changing magnetic field, and if we tap into the secondary side of the auto transformer, then we can either increase or decrease our voltage, okay? So when you make your changes on your control panel, what you're doing is you're making contacts on the secondary side of this. So you're either increasing or you're decreasing the voltage. So it's a variable turns resistor, it's a variable turns transformer. It works off of self-induction being that it both creates a magnetic field and creates the alternating current on the secondary side, okay? So that's the only one of these that we call an auto transformer. That's also a rheostat. This is also a rheostat. You can turn it up, turn it down, okay? So you can increase voltage, you can decrease voltage. Now, again, back to last semester, extremely high voltage is dangerous to work with, okay? So we don't, and it's hard to work with, it's kind of fickle. So we don't want to deal with very, very high voltage. So if we have our voltage fixed before it gets to the auto transformer, and our auto transformer, the contacts are right, and we make our adjustments, then we have to be able to measure what our voltage is, okay? So this doesn't measure kVp, it just measures voltage. Once it gets over here, then what we've got is we've got alternating current setting up a changing magnetic field, and we move this one over close to it. That changing magnetic field sets up an alternating current in the secondary side. Because we have more turns over here than over here, and this is kind of a deceptive thing, these turns should be little bitty tiny and should be, you know, the difference between them should be 500 to 1 or 1,000 to 1, something like that. Once you get to here, we get our kilovoltage. So why are we reading it over here? Well, because this never changes. This is always going to increase by the same magnitude. It's always going to increase by the same amount. So if you know you've got 100 kVp here and our turns ratio is 1 to 1,000, what that means is that if I know I have 100 volts here, I'm going to have 100 kVp over here every time. If I have 99, it's going to be 99,000. If I have 80, it's going to be 80,000 every single time. It doesn't change. So we can put our kVp meter here in anticipation of becoming kVp. So the components that create our high voltage, we have to fix it, and then we have to adjust it, and we have to measure it, and then we have to make kVp. Okay? So again, what we've got is our line compensation. We got our meter to read that. It's just all part of the line compensation circuit. And then we've got our auto transformer. That's where we adjust our kVp, even though we don't have kVp yet. and we measure it with what we refer to as a pre-reading kVp meter. Why is it a pre-reading kVp meter? Because where do you get kVp? We don't have kVp yet, right? So it's pre-reading kVp meter. So we read it here, and then we boost it there, and it becomes kVp. Okay? So those are basic components of the X-ray circuit. That's pretty much all of these next slides.
Did you post this one on Canvas already?
I have not yet, because I was working on it this morning, but I will.
Okay.
So our auto transformer, all it does is we can change our voltage, and then the kVp meter reads voltage, and then it turns into kilovoltage at the step up.
Right, right. If we get it right at the auto transformer, then we know it's gonna be right at the step-up transformer. Yeah. All right, so, again, this is more, just summary of what we talked about before, kVp meters and low voltage circuit. And that's for safety. So just more diagrams, same thing. Okay, so what does kVp control an X-ray beam? Pretty much everything, really. So assume the kVp is primary control of X-ray beam energy. What controls our energy, or what, when we talk about kVp energy and changing kVp energy, what actually changes in a single photon? Two things, and they're inversely proportional. One is wavelength, yeah, and the other is frequency, right? So we're talking about frequency and wavelength. So a higher, higher X-ray energy X-ray beam is one that is more likely to penetrate. So, X-rays exist, in the upper 10,000 volt range, all the way up to as high as you can create. So, so we have X-rays that can be generated at very, very low levels, or 1,000 volt range, that are not going to penetrate anything at all, and they're just totally useless. So kVp controls the penetration, therefore it controls the quality of the X-ray beam. Okay, so a higher X-ray beam, a higher quality X-ray beam, quality should be in there, is one that is more likely to penetrate. Increasing kVp increases the potential energy. When that potential is released, it becomes kinetic energy, and therefore the energy of the BREMS radiation that we create. So as we increase kVp, we're going to increase that peak energy, but we also increase everything in the BREMS spectrum. So kVp is has more effect than any other factor on image receptor exposure, and that's absolutely true. So it increases the area under the BREMS spectrum. We're going to take a look at the BREMS spectrum here in a minute. It increases the penetrability of the X-ray beam, whether or not we actually penetrate and we can get an actual X-ray image. Changes the imaging characteristics of the X-ray beam. And what I mean by that is, you've got three different potential interactions, right? There are really four. So an X-ray photon can enter the patient, pass through the patient, not touching anything, exit the patient, and hit the image receptor, and that's straight penetrability. So we can have one that enters the patient and bounces around and then exits the patient, and we call that? What's that? It's penetration. It's penetration, but it's scattered, right? We got photons that can enter the patient and just absorb, and that's photoelectric. And then we've got X-ray photons that can enter the patient, bounce around, then absorb. Okay? So between bounce around and exit the patient, bounce around and absorb, that's where the difficulty comes in with scatter radiation and what happens with kVp. Okay, so more on that later. So it increases the penetrability of the beam, and it changes the imaging characteristics of the beam, because what happens is that we get a decrease in differential absorption. Differential absorption means you've got absorption inside of the patient in different tissue types. Okay, so just spin that whole thing around. differential absorption, absorption in different tissue types.
So it decreases that, or increases that?
It decreases it, right. So if you increase kVp, you penetrate more tissue types more similarly, okay? So now muscle and fat are penetrated at the same rate, and bone is even penetrated more similarly, but you can still differentiate it, okay? If you increase to 300 kVp, you're going to penetrate everything, and you're not in a analog type recording media like film. You wouldn't be able to differentiate well bone from soft tissue, even very healthy bone from soft tissue with very, very high kVp. So differential absorption in different tissue types decreases with the increase in kVp, changes the imaging characteristic of the X-ray beam. So it changes the likelihood of any given photon penetrating, including, and that's a big thing there, including the scatter radiation. It decreases the chance of photoelectric absorption. It determines if we have a characteristic spectrum, remembering that we only catalog that inner shell characteristic X-ray creation at 69.5 kVp. And it exponentially increases the number of photons in the remnant beam. So we're going to talk about that here in a minute. So it changes everything. This is a summation of that whole slide, is it changes everything. There's nothing that it doesn't change. It changes quantity, changes quality, changes penetration, changes interaction inside of the patient, changes interaction at the image receptor. Nothing goes untouched by changes in kVp.
So it increases, well, it'll decrease, in a way, decrease scatter because there's more penetration. It goes right through if you increase kVp. But it also increases scatter because the ones that could have got it absorbed scatter around and get through.
Right.
Okay.
And we're going to get there here in a minute. But
Yeah.
that's the sum of, you know what a dichotomy is? You know, you got two different things that are kind of the same thing, but not really.
Yeah.
Or possibly even two things that are totally different, but kind of the same thing. That's kind of what we've got going on here. So if you shoot with low kVp, you're going to create scatter.
Right.
That scatter is not going to exit the patient. All right. So if you shoot with high kVp, even if you create the same amount of scatter, which we're going to look at that, but even if you create the same amount of scatter, that scatter is more likely to exit the patient.
Right. Okay.
And so, did scatter go up?
No.
It didn't really go up, but the scatter to the image receptor did.
Yeah. Okay. That makes sense.
Yeah. So, and again, we'll get there in a second. So, with the increases in kVp, again, we increase everything. And yeah.
So I thought that the only thing that changed the minimum was filtration, so how does kVp affect
Okay. Yes. Okay. It doesn't affect where we start with our minimum. So yes. Yeah. It doesn't do that. What X-rays that are emitted, though, we're going to get more of those, lower energy X-ray photons, which is kind of where I'm going to start here. All right. So. I probably should have copied this slide a little bit lower, but mentally imagine, we've got these two brim spectra, and I'm trying to simplify things as much as I can. I got some math in here that I kind of simplified as well. We'll take a look at that. But let's just looking at these two brim spectra. If we could divide these out, and again, this is kind of the wording in the test question on Wednesday was ambiguous. So if we could divide this out and say everything below 25 kVp absorbed inside of the patient, okay? Everything below this point right here absorbed inside of the patient, which is probably not going to be true, but just for sake of argument, let's say it does. Then what's going to happen to patient exposure if the only thing that we change is kVp? It's going to go up, right? So we've got everything below that. So if we increase kVp, full stop, does patient dose go up?
Yes.
Absolutely. All right. So now at 50, from 25 to 50 kVp, let's say we get half of those photons absorbed inside the patient. Okay, so we went from half or none penetrating to 50% of them penetrating. So what happened to our patient dose? Still went up, right? And then from 69 and above, we got nothing but penetration. What happened to penetration?
Went up.
It went up, right. So where the mystery lies is in this area right here. If those had no interaction except for penetration, and half of these interacted with the patient and absorbed, and half of them interacted with the patient and transmitted, then what we're going to have is not just an increase in patient exposure, but an increase in scatter and an increase in
Penetration.
with penetration image receptor exposure. Okay. So again, we're going to talk about that here in a bit. So the area under the curve represents total tube output in numbers. So when we say increases in kVp increase our our tube output, increase in kVp increase our intensity. Is that true? Well, looking back at that, what represents intensity? Mass. Numbers, just numbers. What represents in the brim spectrum? Numbers.
Under the curve.
Just that area under the spectrum. So, true, absolutely true. The numbers increase, and we increase at all levels that we emit. Saving for those low energy photons that are filtered out. But the ones that do make it through at low kVp are going to make it through a high kVp, right? So, what we increase, we have a tendency to think, go back to the brim spectrum, on a superficial level, we have a tendency to think, okay, I increased my kVp, and what I increased was from here to here. Oh no, not even close. What we increased was from here to here, but we also increased all that, right? So we got a tremendous increase in numbers, plus we got more penetration. So everything goes up.
Increase numbers, which means you increase average, which means you increase penetration.
Right. Well, the peak, mainly the average, but yeah. So all of that stuff is touched by kVp. Okay, so as kVp increases, we add the higher photons, but we keep all those low energy photons as well. So it shifts to the high energy side. Peak is increased. Higher kVp gives us more of the penetration, changes that differential absorption. All right, so I hope you did, but if you brought your Bushong with you, flip to page 139. So 139 kind of goes through the effects of kVp. So as kVp is increased, the area under the curve increases. That's just numbers. Until you get above your original kVp setting, then it's numbers plus increase in energy. So the relative distribution shifts to the higher energy side. The area under the curve has approximately doubled. So he runs through this problem on page 140. He's talking about going from 72 to 82 kVp. All right. So it says, if you're looking at that, it said notice that at 72 kVp, the area under the curve increased from 3.6 to 4.7. So to find an average, or not an average, but a percentage of anything, a percentage of increase, what we would do is subtract the 3.6 from 4.7. That would give us 1.1. So 1.1 divided by our original value, 3.6, that gives us an actual increase in 0.305556. Is that double? No. That's about a third, right? So how is it that he's saying that the area underneath the brim spectrum is doubled? Well, there's some nuance that you have to understand. There's some context that you need to get And you can't really get that until you pull the parts of separate chapters together and take a look at it holistically. Okay, so the area under the spectrum only increased by about 30%. It didn't really increase by a factor of 2. It increased in that example by about 30%. All right, so more on that in a second. So that partially explains it, and he goes on page 40, the mathematical equation on page 140 partially explains the rule of thumb that states that a 15% increase in kVp is equivalent to a doubling of the mass. But is it? Well, we just looked at it. If mass is numbers, 30% does not equal 100%, right? So if that area under the brim spectrum only went up by 30%, then the output from the X-ray tube didn't double, right? But as we increase kVp, what did change?
Penetration.
Penetration. Here we go. So going on down, a 15% increase in kVp does not double the X-ray intensity. So you have to take those two things together. You can't just read one and then read the other because they're contradictory. Okay, so a 15% increase in kVp does not double the X-ray intensity, but it's equivalent to doubling the mass at the image receptor. Why?
Because penetration.
Because of penetration, right. So that 30% increase in kVp gives us, or that 30% increase in numbers along with that increase in penetration, gives us the effect of doubling, but at the image receptor. Because the kVp went up, and we got those increase in numbers, we're going to double what comes out of the patient, not what goes into the patient. Okay?
So the 50% rule only deals with the image receptor?
Image receptor. Now, we're going to tie it into radiation dose here in a minute.
Okay, now wait for my question.
Okay, okay. All right. So what we would have to do in order to double the output from the X-ray tube of kVp is increase, and it's not really 40%. I did the math this morning, and it was like 40.22% or something like that. We'd have to increase our kVp by a little over 40% to get an actual doubling of the exposure for, pre-patient. So it goes on to say intensity, as just the number of X-rays, varies rapidly with an increase in kVp. If kVp were doubled, then the intensity would increase by a factor of 4. So if we back up to this here, so he says doubling the output from the X-ray tube will require an increase in 40 kVp. Let me just show you something. We'll do this. All right. So if you have one mass, all right, and you multiply that times 1.4, then you would have a 40% increase, right? So it really equated to something I think is 4.22. All right, so if we multiply 1.1 times 1.422, then our new output as we increased by 40% is 142% higher than what it was before. Right? If we do it a second time, we get to that. Third time, we get to that. Fourth time, we get to that. Okay? So with a doubling of the kVp, we can get to 4 times the exposure, image receptor exposure, or actually output from X-ray tube. So the mathematical equation on page 144 partially explains the rule of thumb. Oh, we already did that. So the intensity would double, if we double kVp, it'd go up by a factor of 4. So what do we call that kind of relationship?
Squared.
It's squared, which is, the square is a exponentially, right. So it's an exponential change. What else is an exponential change? The dropping hints, square laws?
Inverse and direct square.
Inverse and direct square laws, right. So how do they work? You double the distance, the inverse square, according to the inverse square law, double distance from a radiation source, then the, exposure goes down by a factor of four, right? So kVp then, if you increase your kVp by a factor of 2, the output from the X-ray tube goes up by a factor of 4. What would happen at the image receptor?
It would also go by factor of 4.
It'd go up by a factor of more than 4, really, because 30% increased the output by a factor of 2, right? 40% increases output from the tube by a factor of 2. So a doubling of the kVp is going to increase the exposure to the patient by a factor of 4, but to the image receptor even more than that. Okay, so it's more significant than the inverse or direct square law.
So the doubling the kVp increases the intensity to the image receptor by a factor of 4, or out of the tube?
Out of the tube
Okay.
by a factor of 4. And since we've got so much higher kVp than the incident exposure at the image receptor is going to be even higher than that. Does that make sense? Okay. All right. So as kVp is increased, penetrability of the X-ray beam is increased, and relatively fewer X-rays are absorbed by the patient. That word relative and relativity in this case is huge. All right, and we've kind of touched on that already. So as kVp is increased, the penetrability of the X-ray beam is increased, and relatively fewer X-rays are absorbed by the patient. So is wording on 140 confusing? Yeah, because he says one thing and he seems to go immediately back on it, right? So is it made better on 147? Not exactly. So first sentence says 15% change doubles the output from the tube. It does not. It doubles at the image receptor. The last paragraph, the penetrability of the X-ray beam is increased and less radiation is absorbed by the patient, leaving a proportionally greater number of X-rays to expose. That should be IR. Okay, so let me correct that. All right, so what does that mean?
So it means whenever penetration is increased, the patient absorbs less because they're more likely to either scatter through the patient or just penetrate all the way through.
Right. Okay, so let's run through a couple of different exercises. We increase kVp, and that's the only thing that we do. And what happens? Brim spectrum goes up. We increase low energy, we increase moderate energy, and we increase those that are most likely to penetrate. Right? So what happens to patient dose if kVp is the only thing that we change? Yeah, dose is going to go up dramatically. Okay? So is there a way that, since I already started into it, is there a way that we could change our kVp and reduce patient dose?
Yeah. Change your mass with it.
Change mass with it, right. So we increase kVp and we decrease mass, and we'll get there too. So again, both things can be true. Can you increase kVp and increase patient dose?
Yes, if that's the only thing that changes.
If that's the only thing you change, increase kVp, increase patient dose. Can you increase or decrease patient dose with increasing kVp? And that is also yes. Increase kVp, decrease mass. All right, so that's in here too. So, the statement, I said, requires context. Increasing kVp alone does not categorically lessen the amount of radiation absorbed by the patient. Increasing kVp, if that's the only thing that you do, then absorption in the patient is going to go up, right? If you don't do anything, again, if we divide this out, if we divide this out and say everything below 25 kVp absorbed only, right? Then when we change from 72 kVp to 82 kVp, what happened to absorption in the patient?
Went up.
it went up, patient dose went up, right? Still went up, and then above that, maybe it went down. Okay? So just increasing kVp alone does not necessarily mean that all of the x-rays that we emit from the tube are gonna have a higher chance of going through the patient. Okay? So what in that then is most likely to penetrate?
High energy.
The high energy, right. So those high energy photons, are they less likely to interact with the patient?
Yes.
The answer is yeah. So those, yeah, absolutely. The higher the kVp, the lower the interaction inside the patient. All of that still exists though. So your patient dose is gonna go up dramatically.
Mm-hmm.
But yet, at the same time, as the kVp goes up, what happens?
Penetration goes up.
More penetration, less interaction.
Less.
So simultaneously, both of them are true.
So.
You starting to see why I don't get into this until sophomore year, most years? It's confusing. This is, it's the most confusing part of the most confusing part of the curriculum is kVp.
So how would we see that? Would we see it as if you're like on a question, say at the high end or high energy end of kVp on the Brim spectrum, what happens to patient dose? It would decrease.
I'm not going to get that specific.
Okay.
Neither is registry. So in generalities, you're going to have to look at the question. And a question on Wednesday didn't have enough information. And I keep saying Wednesday is right? Wednesday?
Yeah.
Is when, okay. All right. So it didn't have enough information. So the questions are one. If you get a question that says, as kVp goes up, what happens to patient dose? That's the only thing it says. Only thing it says. Patient dose is going to go up. Right. If you get one that says, as kVp goes up, and if you increase your kVp by 15%, you reduce your mass by, factor 2, then your radiation dose to the patient is going to go down. Right. As you increase kVp and you don't say anything else, what happens to the image receptor exposure?
Goes up.
It goes up, right. So in as much as, the scenario you mentioned, you're not going to see that.
Okay.
I'm not even going to throw that at you, and the registry's not either. Okay. So increasing kVp alone does not just magically remove interactions from the X-ray beam. Those high energy X-ray photons, the higher energy X-ray photons that we create are less likely to absorb, but we're still going to have all that. Right, so patient dose is still going to go up. Low energy, highly absorbing photons are still created, still emitted, still absorbed by the patient. Medium energies are still going to expose the patient. They have a greater chance of penetration, and they have a greater chance of penetration as scattered photons as well, right? So back to it, all of these, you've got, in this very simplistic scenario, we've got penetration. We've got scatter and penetration, right? And we've got full absorption. We've got scatter with absorption, scatter with penetration. And a lot is tied up in this middle section, right? Straight absorption. So as we increase kVp, did interaction go down? Yeah, in context. Did interaction go up? Also, yeah, in context. Did radiation dose go down? In this scenario, no, because we just increased kVp. Okay, just increase in kVp, increase in patient dose, increase in radiation exposure. We got started a little bit late, but all right, so we're gonna have to pull it up. I got chickens at home, and the water is frozen, so I gotta go home, take an early lunch. I got a 12 o'clock meeting. I gotta thaw out their water and get back to my meeting. Any questions on this? This might be a 3-day lecture, actually.
So whenever you ask questions about this, is it smart to think of it in threes? You think of low energy, you're gonna absorb, middle, you're gonna have scatter with absorption and penetration, and then the high intensity, you're gonna have penetration.
Yeah.
In a nutshell.
Yeah. Any of those can occur at any energy level.
Right.
You know, these down here, realistically, you can penetrate a ridiculous number of things with 25 kVp.
Right.
Skin, absolutely. Soft tissue, probably. But in general, yeah.
So like, if we're thinking like in general, this is the most likely occurrence at this.
Yeah.
Okay.
With a higher kVp, the higher the kVp goes, that upper registry is more or let's say less likely to interact in any way.
Okay.